Voice America. Live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be talking about life this first hour. And a little bit later, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. But first of all, we want to once again reintroduce our guests who have been on the program with us many times before. Going to talk more about this organization called the Council for Life, what we can do to stand for life, why is it abortions seem to be going up after the Dobbs decision, and what we can do about that. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. But let me again go around the round table. First of all, we have Suzanne Everbach, who is the Director of Communications and Philanthropy. We have a very lengthy bio for you there in terms of your law background and the rest. But Suzanne, always great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Kerby. It's a pleasure to be here.
Leanne Morris is the Executive Director of Council for Life. Again, we have all of their background. As a matter of fact, if you click on the button that says See More, you can see their very extensive background, which takes up more than a screen. So it shows, again, how gifted these individuals are. Leanne, it is great to have you back again.
We are grateful to be here to talk about Council for Life and the life issue. Thank you, Kerby.
Let's talk about Council for Life for just a minute, because some of our listeners might remember the conversations we've had with you. But I think one of the reasons for that, in addition to education, which we're going to talk about in just a minute, is fundraising. And that is, as you well know, I've spoken at a fair number of pregnancy resource centers all over the country. And one thing I found is they were always overworked and underfunded. And the Council for Life has a lot of ministries, but one of those is not only education, but the fundraising that takes place. So these organizations, which are doing very good work, but maybe don't have the skills in terms of fundraising, you're able to help them out.
Absolutely. That is the heart of Council for Life. And I like to say that February is the best month of Council for Life, because that's when we do the research into the grant projects that we receive from the grant agencies. And we are so blessed to be able to send out board members to current and former board members to do the research of the grant application and then come back and report on what they found. And this year we had a record 42 agencies apply and go through the process for a grant. And we will be announcing very soon the 2026 grant beneficiaries.
Yes.
Council for Life was started in 2001. And so we are celebrating our 25th anniversary of education and fundraising. And so over that 25 years, we have given $20 million to those agencies that, support our mission and are life affirming in their outreach. The whole spectrum of the life issue is covered: pregnancy resource centers, maternity homes, adoption and foster care, post-abortion healing, and then the mentoring and the life skills that are needed for the moms facing unplanned pregnancies.
Suzanne, again, you work in the area of philanthropy, and a lot of people probably ask you before they want to give what you might be providing, but you're asking the same thing of many of these various groups. And I found that a lot of people say, I'm aware of some of these different homes, I'm aware of some of these different groups that speak to sex education or philanthropy, but I don't really understand exactly what's going on. And that's one of the benefits, because if Council for Life gives you a grant, it already shows other donors why they can get involved as well.
Exactly. And as Leanne mentioned, we just went through our beneficiary selection process. So our donors know that all of our beneficiaries have been vigorously researched and vetted. And it's just such an honor to come alongside these agencies, who meet women and men facing an unplanned pregnancy exactly where they are, with compassion and non-judgment. They come alongside them not only during the pregnancy, but afterwards. Yes. So they have the medical care, they have the vital resources to flourish as a family, if they choose to parent, or to maybe even place that precious baby for adoption with a forever loving home. And so our mission is empowering women, men, and youth to make life-affirming choices. And we do that with our fundraising, as Leanne said, and we educate, which is, I think, what you were getting to, Kerby. We educate our community about the humanity of the unborn child and these vast resources that our beneficiaries provide. And also the sad part, the devastating harm of abortion. You know, there are so many out there who are in need of healing because they've had an abortion experience.
That's very true. Yeah. Leanne, again, this is one of the things that I'm so excited about because the educational part is very important. And again, you have a number of events, at least for our Dallas listeners, that they can attend. But for others, they might want to contact you and find out how they could put together something in their community because you're working to educate young adults, certainly men, the whole issue of family. And so there's a number of different ways in which people can participate, can't they?
Absolutely, Kerby. For our Dallas listeners, 2026 is going to be an exciting year for educational events, and I will cover those. But for listeners outside of the DFW area or outside of Texas, please go to our YouTube channel, Counsel for Life YouTube channel, because we have literally decades of speakers recorded. Our luncheon speakers, men's breakfast, trout lecture, all kinds of phenomenal pro-life speakers. Probably every pro-life speaker in the country has been a speaker for Counsel for Life at one time or another. And so we are just so blessed to be able to share that really literally with the world through our YouTube channel. But coming up, we have, I also want to mention, we will get on our YouTube channel very soon an event that we did in February where we had a panel of experts talk about teen attitudes, Gen Z and Gen A's attitudes on sex, contraceptives, and abortion. And that we wanted to equip parents with the facts of what children are being educated with in their schools and the way in which, as Christians, they can rewrite the script that's going on in the teen minds about those issues. And so that was a fabulous educational event. And then we have something coming up for young adults, April 1st at a location here in Dallas with, again, another expert panel, Kyle Waldrop, Todd Wagner, and Jackie Deason. They will be talking about how do we defend the defenseless unborn. And so what can young adults do? How can they be share the truth about the unborn baby, share the truth about the harm of abortion with their peers, because that's the generation that is making the decision whether the baby lives or dies. And then we'll, of course, have our luncheon speaker, yet to be announced, but we will have a luncheon speaker on October 29th at the Anatole Hilton in the Trinity Ballroom. And then we will have the Trout Lecture. And so it's going to be a wonderful year of events. We also are working on our men's breakfast, but again, to be determined, speaker not yet announced. So.
Good news is that we have a link to Counsel for Life. You might go during the break here right now. They have a video gallery. You can also go to YouTube. And, of course, if you go to YouTube, you also see the great interview that you did recently with Joe Martin, which was in the God Seeker podcast. Yes. So, again, you can see that. Of course, you can also watch what we're showing right now. And, again, we will make that available later on YouTube and a variety of other platforms, including Facebook and a variety of others. But we need to take a break, and we're going to come back and talk about this issue of pro-life, all that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Debate about U.S. military action against Iran is often influenced by someone's age and understanding of recent history. Whenever I talk about events in the 1990s, I realize that many of my listeners have not experienced that history. And if we're talking about something that happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, even fewer have experienced it. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was driven from power by the Ayatollah Khomeini. At the same time, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard seized the U.S. Embassy and took hostage 52 American diplomats and staff. This was the beginning event in what has become a half-century undeclared war against the U.S. Iran has engaged in a proxy war against the U.S. for decades. In April 1983, Iranians used Hezbollah forces to blow up the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. That action killed 63 people. In October of that year, Iran used Hezbollah forces to blow up the U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 service members. Even while the U.S. was in Iraq fighting a war on terror, Iran was attacking our troops with munitions made in Iran with the coordination of Iranian operatives. And in the last few decades, Iran has been the chief sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East because it has been funding the attacks by Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The greatest danger would be a nuclear-armed Iran. Until the recent U.S. attacks, Iran has the largest stockpile of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. These missiles have a range of 2,000 kilometers and therefore can reach Israel and other countries in the Middle East. The facts and our history are clear. Iran has been a threat to its neighbors and the U.S. for the last 47 years. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking about the issue of pro-life, but we're also going to get into some of the policies and politics of that as well. We have in studio with us today Leanne and Suzanne, and you can find all sorts of information about them and Counsel for Life as you go to the website at pointofview.net. But Suzanne, let me, if I can, for just a minute, come to the fact that, of course, Counsel for Life was created in the state of Texas, and the state of Texas has really funded many of these pro-life groups, but you've come alongside. Now we have had the decision of Dobbs, which overturned Roe versus Wade. We're still dealing with a lot of these political issues. They almost seem worse than before. What's your thoughts?
Yes, Kerby. Well, I'm sure you, like we all were, we were elated when we had the monumental victory in 2022 of the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the tragic decision in 1973 that legalized abortion in all 50 states. So we were thrilled, and we logically thought that abortion numbers would go down. But sadly, the exact opposite is true. Abortion numbers are on the rise. Mm-hmm. And even here in the state of Texas, where we are very pro-life here, by the way, in the Lone Star State, we have the arguably the strongest abortion ban in the United States of America, but we still see abortion. We had 50,000 abortions in our state last year. Last year, there were 1.1 million babies aborted in our country. Abortion is the leading cause of death in America and in Texas, and probably in the DFW area. And the reason this is happening, Kerby, is because of chemical abortion pills. Right. And the proliferation of these deadly pills, which were approved by the FDA in 2020 under the Clinton administration. And, at that time, the FDA did recognize the inherent dangers of the pills. Of course, the baby dies from these poisonous pills, but they are also can be very harmful to the mother. In fact, there was a study last year that found that 1 in 10 women have a serious adverse event like sepsis, hemorrhaging. Mm-hmm. Many end up in the ER. And so, here in Texas, I do want to give a shout out to our Texas legislature. Last year, they pushed through 7 pro-life bills, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. One of those bills was the Woman and Child Protection Act.
Right.
And the purpose of that law is to combat the illegal trafficking of these pills. What happened, Kerby, is over the Obama and Biden administration, some of those safeguards that the FDA had put in place were lifted. During COVID and on into the Biden administration, the requirement for a woman to have an in-person doctor's visit, in-person dispensing of the pills, gone.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? It means that anybody can get these pills. They can order them online, just a few clicks, cheaply, have the pills delivered in the mail to their doorstep. And that is subverting our pro-life laws in Texas and all the other pro-life states across the nation. And so we are frustrated. We're grateful. We're grateful for Dobbs. We're grateful that Planned Parenthood was defunded for at least a year in the Trump administration last year, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
Women are dying. And we need to, at a minimum, we are imploring, as our congressional leaders in the Senate, in the House, our attorneys general across the country, our pro-life leaders, pastors, APLOG, medical doctors. We're imploring HHS and the FDA to reinstate, at a minimum. We want the pills to be gone. We want them to be pulled. But at a minimum, reinstate this in-person dispensing requirement to get them out of the mail. It would save countless babies. It would enable us to enforce our Texas abortion ban, and it would save so many women from this harm.
Let me just mention that, first of all, you can go to Counsel for Life and get some of that information. We also, if you do a search engine, just type in chemical abortion booklet, that will pop up a way in which you can get a PDF of what you have in front of you by Liberty McCarter. And I do want to get to Leanne, but one other thought I might just mention while we're talking about the politics for just a minute. I've known... Now he's Judge Matthew Kacsmaryk for a long time, and you both got a chance to meet him.
Yes.
Let's at least get a shout out for somebody who in the federal judiciary said what the FDA did was wrong, what the Obama administration and the Biden administration was wrong. And I certainly appreciate the fact that we do have pro-life judges.
Yes, absolutely. And Leanne and I did get the honor of meeting Judge Kacsmaryk at an Alliance Defending Freedom open house. They have a beautiful new office in Dallas, so we were able to thank him for his bold and courageous stand. I mean, Kerby, I'm sure you know, he has received death threats.
Yes.
And so we just applaud him. And we need more bold leaders like that to be a voice for the voiceless. And we believe that there are two patients. When there's a pregnant mama, her baby is that second patient. So we also thank APLOG for, because they really push that narrative as well. Two patients. The safety of both is paramount.
Leanne, let me talk about that for just a minute, because I've said before that if this drug were being dispensed for anything other than abortion, the kind of pushback that would come from women saying this is a threat to women's bodies. But because it is related to abortion, all the negative aspects of it, of which there are many, young women go into the hospital, some have getting sepsis, some even have lost their lives. There's just a blind eye to some of that, don't you think?
Absolutely. One of the ways in which we hope that this is remedied is by the FDA taking action.
Yes.
And we pray and we hope that that happens through the administration. But it also might happen through the courts. And we are closely watching a case in Louisiana where Louisiana has sued the FDA, and they are asking for an injunction that the pills not be allowed on the market without in-person doctor's visits. And the response from the FDA is, well, we would like a stay of this litigation so that we can complete our own internal review. There was the review that Suzanne mentioned that was performed, but the FDA wants to do their own internal review. It seems like an unreasonable delay to us, because babies are dying and women are being harmed. And like you say, could you imagine if this were a diabetes drug and it was being dispensed without an in-person doctor's visit? How could you possibly know that it would be the right drug for this particular individual without doing an examination, without knowing if she's pregnant, without knowing her blood type, without knowing all the things that a doctor needs to know?
Well, and again, a lot of this gets back to the fact that we really need to communicate a culture of life.
We do.
I remember years ago when I was speaking saying, right now we can oftentimes catch an abortion-minded woman before she goes to a clinic. And we've had on this program many individuals that have been out there wanting to encourage women to reconsider their choice. But I said, what happens when we have abortion pills that you can get through a pharmacy? Well, then you'd have to catch them before they go into a drugstore. Well, as Suzanne pointed out, they're not going to a drugstore. They're just getting them online. And by the way, we don't even know if those drugs are being manufactured in China or Honduras, or whether they're actually going to be effective. I mean, just the kind of blindness that is all associated with abortion. But it kind of illustrates, again, that in this post-Roe era, when we come back from the break, I'd like to maybe have you address what can we do, because we really need to promote even more a culture of life, because we don't have the ability now to maybe catch someone on their way to an abortion clinic or even going to the drugstore. They're just making those decisions in the privacy of their home. They're also endangering their own lives, not to mention the lives of the unborn, in their own home and all of that. So what can we do in terms of education? And then, again, you'll learn a lot more about Counsel for Life. We'll come back and take a break, but let's open up the phones too. Perhaps you are familiar with some of the things they've been doing. Maybe you can share a little bit about what you're doing in the pro-life battle. We are certainly pro-life here at Point of View, have always been. And in some respects, it is a new day because the changing ideas are still out there. It's important for us to stand for life, and that's what we'll be talking about. But we need to take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. That scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, or sit back and take some notes. By the way, we are working off of an outline, and I suspect they would be glad to make that available to you if you contact Counsel for Life, or they would certainly love to have you invite them to come or send someone to come and speak at your group, because in some respects, we really need to not only address the problem, which we've talked about, but what can we do to change this? And first of all, Leanne, let me come to you, because you have at least 3 strategic initiatives to end abortion. And I think everybody that has something to write with needs to write those down, because you can implement every one of those in your own community. But talk about what you're doing right now.
Thank you, Kerby. We are so appreciative of pro-life laws. Our Texas legislature is phenomenal, but laws will not end abortion. We have to change hearts and minds. And we do that through our educational programs here in North Texas, but what about in the rest of the state? What about in the rest of the country? And so we have these 3 strategic initiatives. First is affiliate growth. We know that the Counsel for Life model works. We know from what we have done for 25 years here in North Texas that the model works to educate and to fundraise. And so we took that model to Central Texas, to Waco. And this is the 6th year for the Central Texas affiliate model that is educating in Central Texas and fundraising. And they have funded over $560,000 to 13 agencies in the Waco and surrounding counties. What we hope to do is to take that model to Fort Worth and the surrounding counties north and west of Tarrant County. And we think that will happen this year, that we will get that board off the ground and that they will then be fundraising and supporting the agencies in those counties. And that can happen really literally anywhere. And we hope to continue to do that in the other Texas cities, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, all of the cities. Our goal, our desire, our prayer is for every county in Texas to be served by a Counsel for Life affiliate, and then, of course, the nation. Our second strategic initiative is church engagement. We can't do this without changing hearts and minds, and a wonderful place to start changing hearts and minds is within the church. And we are so grateful. This year, we had 11, and I think eventually we'll have 12 churches in the DFW area that will host a Counsel for Life table. We did it over Sanctity of Life Sundays, the Sundays that surround the date of the Roe decision in January. And what we do is we go and we engage with the congregation. We share the names of our beneficiaries, what we're doing in the community, and what the value of human life in the womb. And those congregational meetings that we have with our tables are so effective. But what we want is for the church to even go deeper and to do 4 things. The church could preach, obviously, and teach God's design for sex, family, and marriage, and that is crucial to ending abortion. Mm-hmm. And then the church can also show its congregation how to love its neighbor in an unplanned pregnancy. And the church can do that by physically providing volunteers to pregnancy resource centers, like you have said. They are so understaffed and underfunded, and they need assistance. Same with maternity homes, same with adoption agencies. The church can encourage adoption and foster care through their members. The church can share the gospel with women and men who have experienced abortion. That's the heart of the church. Mm-hmm. And those women and men are sitting in the pews and they are hurting. And they want to know that Jesus died for them and that their sins are forgiven. And that is such a crucial part of church engagement for us. And then, just having a safe space to talk about what's happening in their lives. And so then our third strategic initiative is young adult worldview transformation. And we do that by engaging with college students and young adults in the community. And we are so grateful for several organizations that help with that effort. Youth Equipped to Succeed, I think you mentioned Dan Bailey and his organization, going into the high schools and the middle schools and teaching the success sequence. Finish high school, get a job, go to college, get married, and then have children. And what's happening, of course, with our teens is the exact opposite.
Right.
The baby first, and then you try to put the pieces together, and most often, 90-some-odd% of those students end up in poverty when the baby comes first.
Right.
And so it's heartbreaking, and we know it can be changed. We also go on the college campuses with our beneficiaries like Students for Life of America that start pro-life groups and teach and train college students to be leaders of the pro-life groups on their campuses. Texas Right to Life, their fellowships. And so we are so dedicated to engaging the young adults. And I call that basically under 40. Because like we said earlier, they are the ones making the decision about what happens to the baby.
We have some callers that want to address that in just a minute. But Suzanne, let me come to you for just a minute, because on the one hand, we say the younger you are, the more likely you are to be pro-life. But it isn't necessarily they've thought through that. They just think, well, it's sort of a justice issue. It's not right that someone could end the life of another, but they don't necessarily come to it with biblical convictions or even strong convictions. Is that fair?
Yes, I do think that's very fair, Kerby. And I think it goes back to the fact that this unborn baby is a human.
Yes.
And I think once they understand that, for some reason, our culture clings to the right to abortion. But the young people, they have the science. It's so clear. We have a beneficiary live action that produces these animated, compelling 3D videos that show the development of a baby from conception until the moment of birth. And so we're trying to help. We're funding Baby Oliver, which goes through his development. And if that can't change a heart and a mind, I don't know what can. And so we're hoping and praying that videos like Baby Oliver, they've also done one called Baby Olivia, can get into the schools, starting at early childhood. If children are raised up, they have a natural inclination to abhor abortion. They can't imagine a little baby being killed, an innocent, defenseless baby being killed. So I think that education from a very early age is key. I can't quite get my head wrapped around why there's so many angry voices clinging to that right, that bodily autonomy. I think
shout your abortion.
I think, and I think Kerby, and I'm sure Leanne would agree with me. I think a great deal of that has to do with people being post-abortive, and they want to, in their mind, make it okay, and the guilt and the pain that they feel. So that's why that healing is just so paramount.
Would you mind if we take some phone calls? You'd have to put your earbuds in here, but I thought we might do that. But just as you're doing that, I thought I might say that one of the other things we've noticed with these pregnancy resource centers is they get an ultrasound and the prospective mom can see her baby. That changes everything. But let's take a phone call or two just before we take a break. And we may not get to all the calls, but out in Nevada, Whitney, thank you for calling today.
Oh, good morning. Thank you for your program about preborn, to save the preborn. Steve and I was just talking before the lady just said that we have to educate the young children, showing them these are real human beings. These are not a blob or whatever you call it. Whoever can argue about pro-choice, tell him or her that, thank God your mom is pro-life. That's all I can say. And pray and pray and pray. That's it,
Well, and again, Sunday school will be, I think, a great opportunity to teach that, don't you think? And you just mentioned you have all these videos that people could show, so you wouldn't even have to do all the work if you wanted to show them in a Sunday school class, right?
We have suggested that to our churches in DFW, and please, listeners, you can do that in your area as well. The Baby Olivia and Baby Oliver, if your listeners do one thing after this show, if they watch those two videos, they can go on to YouTube and find them. That will be a victory for us.
Let me just mention, too, that if you click on either one of your pictures, it will take you to counselforlife.org. Upper right-hand corner, I mentioned it before, but let's talk about it again. You have the affiliates, you have the grants, all the rest, but go down to media. No matter where you are in the country, look at the photo gallery, but especially the video library. And then, of course, you can also go to Counsel for Life at YouTube and find some of those. Or if you are one of those people that's searching around and can't find everything, you have a contact point, and so I'm sure they would be glad to respond to you. So let me encourage you as we go to a break to go to the website, Counsel for Life. You can find out a little bit more about some of the things that they are doing. They have, of course, a calendar, a place where you can donate, and I would encourage you to do so. And even so, if you would want to develop something similar in your community, I'm sure they'd be glad to hear from you. And even if they weren't necessarily an affiliate, you want to do something at least locally, we need to do more to support life, and we really need to address this issue of the culture of life at a time when we seem to have a culture of death. So let's take a break. We'll come back and talk about a few other possible answers before we run out of time, right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us for a few more minutes, Suzanne as well as Leanne. And Leanne, I thought I'd come to you for just a minute because as we've been talking about Counsel for Life, there are some questions. How can we answer this? How can we respond? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, Kerby, the most important thing we need is courageous leadership. Courageous leadership from government leaders, from the church, even within the home and in the schools, everywhere in our community. We need courage to speak out for the voiceless unborn. And I do want to say a couple of things. We have courageous leadership in the state of Texas. They passed 7 pro-life bills. Some very important things were passed this year, one of which was mandatory adoption education for every high school student in the state of Texas. Praise God.
Yes.
It's amazing. You can probably get that done in any state. So for your listeners out there that are not from Texas, they could probably get that kind of legislation passed. We also have incredible funding for pregnancy centers through the state Thriving Texas Families fund that we do. It came out of Alternatives to Abortion. We also have the Woman and Child Protection Act and the Life of the Mother Act, a statute that is going up in the state capitol of a beautiful woman with her baby that you can see the baby inside at the statue. So great leadership in Texas. We need great leadership within Counsel for Life. As we start these affiliates, we need great leadership in our churches and in our pregnancy centers and in all these agencies that are doing the hard work. And I want to do a shout out to the agencies. Over the past 5 years, they are saving babies' lives in Texas. 40,000 babies have been saved in the pregnancy resource centers in North Texas. They have seen more than 160,000 women over the past 5 years. So there is a little math to be done there. There are women that we don't know if they protected their baby and had that baby, but we can assume a large portion of those women that are not accounted for in the 40,000, some portion of them had abortions.
That's amazing.
So there's work to be done, but there is good news as well. And so we're grateful for that. We need a national effort for post-abortion healing and support. If we have 66 million abortions since the Roe decision, we have at least 50 million women and 50 million men, probably more, who are suffering from post-abortion distress, trauma, emotional, psychological problems. And we need support and healing for them. And I think that comes from the church, but it can come from other areas as well. We obviously need to educate children, as Suzanne was saying, with God's design for sex, family, and marriage, the success sequence, and just the culture. The culture needs to shift and change for a pro-life culture.
Wow. Suzanne, let me, if we can, also talk about some of the legal issues. First of all, I was just thinking, we just mentioned a minute ago, Alliance Defending Freedom. They have a case before the Supreme Court having to do with pregnancy centers. And, of course, we've had all sorts of religious liberty advances, which have been very helpful for pregnancy centers and the rest. But when we get back to this issue of abortion pills or chemical abortion and all sorts of lawsuits, there's a lot can be done there as well, can't there?
Absolutely. And, more good news is that Planned Parenthood facilities, the bricks and mortar, are closing all across the nation.
Very true.
A lot of them in Texas, including the world's largest Planned Parenthood in Houston. So that's great news. But again, we go back to the chemical abortion pills, and that our Texas legislature did. They were very aggressive in passing this, the Woman and Child Protection Act, which really is legislation serving as a model to the rest of the country. And we also applaud our Texas Attorney General. He has filed 3 civil lawsuits concerning these chemical abortion pills coming into our state illegally. One in New York against an abortion doctor, Dr. Margaret Carpenter, one in California, and one, I believe it is in Delaware. I think it's against a nurse practitioner. Okay. All of them mailing pills and killing babies and harming women. The problem Kerby, is the shield laws that pro-abortion states have put in place, like in New York and California. So we really have our work cut out for us. Texas has also joined Florida in kind of reviving that case, the chemical abortion case against the FDA that we talked about a little earlier. It went all the way to this, started with Judge Keksmarek and ended up at the Supreme Court. They just ruled that the petitioners, who were a group of doctors, didn't have standing. So they didn't really address chemical abortion. So we're hoping that the case from Louisiana that Leanne mentioned, and then our Texas and Florida case will be helpful. We're hoping all this ends up again in front of SCOTUS. And
again, you mentioned the one in Louisiana because we have, of course, listeners in Louisiana, but that also affects doctors in New York and California, where we also have programs. And I think some of our listeners right now saying, well, I'm glad you guys live in Texas where you have so many good laws. We don't, and we have legislatures that aren't necessarily as open. But as you mentioned just a minute ago, Leanne, there are some things that can be done. The adoption laws. There's also this idea of, I think I've seen something about safe haven boxes and things of that nature. So there's just a lot that can be done, even if you find yourself in pretty much a pro-abortion state, right?
Yes. And one other thing I want to mention, in a pro-abortion state, you have pregnancy centers helping women, helping them choose life for their babies, and sharing the gospel with them. And let me give you a few more statistics real quick. For the 160,000 women that came to pregnancy resource centers in North Texas, this is just North Texas, 89,000 of them were willing to hear the gospel presentation to them. And then 9,200 made a profession of faith in Christ. And that's awesome news. And that's awesome news for the church. The fields are ripe for the harvest. They're right there in the pregnancy centers. And it's awesome news for women and men fighting for life in any state in our country, because people are willing, these ladies and these dads are willing to hear a gospel presentation. They're willing to hear about Christ.
That's something.
It is something.
And again, we've talked about the fact that the goal of a pregnancy center is to save babies, but it also saves souls. And it's really one of the most effective evangelistic outreaches there. Also noticed in your notes you had a fact that Pope Leo spoke out against abortion.
Yes.
And so if the Pope spoke out against abortion, why can't some of our pastors speak out about abortion? Which gets us back to one of the other points that you made. That is, your local church can be a very key element of this. And since we're running out of time, let me suggest that there are people you know right now that maybe need to hear this broadcast. Maybe even you would like to pass it on to your pastor. You can go to the website, pointofview.net, and click on the button that says watch or listen, because both of our guests are in studio. Or you can go a little bit later to Facebook, or you can go to YouTube or a variety of other places, and then send that link to them. And most importantly, if you have some questions, I suspect that Leanne and Suzanne will be glad to get those questions. And so all you have to do is click on their picture, and it will take you to, again, Counsel for Life. Scroll down to the bottom, and there's an opportunity for it says contact us. And there you go. And they will give you the kind of information that you might need so that you can actually implement some of this in your community. As always, I appreciate the two of you, and thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Come to our luncheon on October 29th at the Hilton Inn.
And reach out to us about starting a Counsel for Life affiliate in your community.
Well, I hope you appreciate this. You can go to counselforlife.org, and you've been listening to Point of View.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to focus some time and attention, as you might imagine, on what is happening in Iran. And then we'll get into some other topics that I think are very relevant to our discussion here today. And if you'd like to join us a little bit later, open the phones up again to give you a chance to make some comments. And you're free to agree or disagree. But first of all, I posted a piece by Mark Lewis, which actually has the interesting title, The Current Middle Eastern Band-Aid. And what he's illustrating is something we've talked about before. Even if you have great success in the Middle East militarily, there are all sorts of very significant challenges for the future. And he focuses on one, just the animosity between Arabs and Jews, primarily between Israel and the Arab nations, mostly from the Arabs, but he also points out some things from Israel. And that doesn't go away just simply because you remove some nuclear weapons and missiles and maybe degraded the military ability of Iran, or even the financial ability of Iran, which was the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East. That just doesn't go away. So that is certainly the case. A little bit later, I do want to talk about the fact that with any kind of war, there are some things you cannot control. And one of those is that oil is almost $100 a barrel. So the cost of gasoline for you and for a lot of individuals is significant. The impact that this could have on a future country, especially a country that maybe is already in a fragile state. The United States might be able to weather the storm, but whether or not it will go into a recession is a question for some conversation. And then, of course, the whole issue of whether or not the change is going to result in any significant difference, a so-called regime change, since the son of Ayatollah Khamenei is now the new supreme leader, at least at the moment, on the table. So there are all sorts of questions surfacing around the military action or the war that we're engaged in. But let me get into a piece by Mark Lewis that just reminds us that we're in the early stages, and there's a lot that can go wrong, and there's some things that can go right. But he starts by saying, look, I hate war. I hate it with a passion. Every single solitary war in human history had its roots in some evil and wickedness of depraved human beings. You know, get rid of sin? Well, we won't have war anymore, but that's not happening. And we recognize that. And he says, look, as much as I hate war, I also know that sometimes you have to prevent greater harm from occurring. And he mentions a few: Napoleon, the Kaiser, Hitler, Tojo, a number of others that you can get to. But that is pretty much, again, a recognition that it's sometimes the best of many really worse options. And that's, I think, where we find ourselves. So after he's made two paragraphs of why he hates war, but why we sometimes have to have a war, he goes on to say, I support what President Trump is doing in Iran, though I certainly wish it didn't have to be done, and that America could mind its own business and take care of its own problems, which is a very legitimate argument, and it's one that's going to be made for some time during this midterm set of elections and all this kind of issue. So we will certainly see that. So he says, whatever other rationales there might be for the conflict in Iran, thwarting the insane leaders of that nation from getting their hands on nuclear weapons is a noble cause. And then he points out that other evil leaders do have nuclear weapons. Of course, one of those is the Chinese Communist Party, and he calls Xi Jinping as an evil individual and do. But he also adds one other point, which we've made before, and it's worth rehearsing once again. The Iranian Ayatollahs, he said, are not only evil, but they are also crazy. They do not think rationally. They have a warped view of the entire concept of politics, and the world simply can't allow crazy people to possess nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, North Korea does, but he doesn't say that, but that's my addition to that. But if nothing else, he recognizes now, quote, the current situation and the current conflict isn't going to solve the problems in the Middle East, not in the long term. It may put a Band-Aid on the present wound, but it will take much more than that to bring civilization, true lasting peace, order, and prosperity to the region. Because, what's he say? The Arabs simply hate the Jews, and the Jews aren't especially fond of Arabs. And so you have a conflict that has festered for some time simply because the Jews, the Jewish people, believe that Israel is their land and it's their land forever. And anyone else living on it, the Palestinians, are usurpers because God gave the Jews their land and it's theirs. However, he says, of course, the Arabs disagree, and thus you have a situation in which they argue that they have the land and it was stolen from them in 1948. Thus, as he says, the two people stare daggers at each other and fight whenever they feel like it. And since 1948, the creation of the modern Israel has been largely a strong supporter of Israel, and in some respects, Israel has had, as he says, an influence over American policy. I think that's maybe a little overstated, but that's something people are saying right now, so I appreciate him putting it in the article as well. And he says who is right and who is wrong is not the purpose of this article. Frankly, he says, I think both sides are wrong, but that's neither here nor there. My point is the current conflict in Iran is, I believe, he says, necessary for various reasons, but it won't solve the long-term, long-standing issue between Jew and Arab. We may get a temporary reprieve, but that's all it will be, temporary. I will tend to be slightly more optimistic than him because if indeed you can look back at what, again, Donald Trump and others, Benjamin Netanyahu, were able to pull together in the so-called Abraham Accords. And if you can get Saudi Arabia to sign on with the Abraham Accords and maybe some other countries, and you have an Iran that is not threatening its neighbors and not funding its neighbors, I bring you back to something I mentioned on Friday, and I've mentioned it before. Go back to the day before in October that Hamas actually attacked Israel. Think about that day that attacked and even the day before and all the things that have transpired since then. Hamas is a shadow of its former self. There is, as we'll point out a little bit later, next hour, or next segment, I should say, Hezbollah is pretty much a shadow of its former self as well. The Houthis don't have the kind of funding to actually bring about attacks. And Iran, though it has devastated a few areas nearby, water salinization plant, desalinization plant, and a hotel here and there, by and large, has used up a lot of its weapons, and its navy is in the bottom of the Persian Gulf. We in the Middle East are a lot safer than we were, say, 2 years ago. And that's, I think, an established fact. You can have a different opinion about the rest, but the facts are what I just stated, and that is a different Middle East than we had just even 2 years ago. Let's take a break. We'll talk about other aspects of this right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Debate about U.S. military action against Iran is often influenced by someone's age and understanding of recent history. Whenever I talk about events in the 1990s, I realize that many of my listeners have not experienced that history. And if we're talking about something that happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, even fewer have experienced it. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was driven from power by the Ayatollah Khomeini. At the same time, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard seized the U.S. Embassy and took hostage 52 American diplomats and staff. This was the beginning event in what has become a half-century undeclared war against the U.S. Iran has engaged in a proxy war against the U.S. for decades. In April 1983, Iranians used Hezbollah forces to blow up the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. That action killed 63 people. In October of that year, Iran used Hezbollah forces to blow up the U.S. Marine barracks, killing 241 service members. Even while the U.S. was in Iraq fighting a war on terror, Iran was attacking our troops with munitions made in Iran with the coordination of Iranian operatives. And in the last few decades, Iran has been the chief sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East because it has been funding the attacks by Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. The greatest danger would be a nuclear-armed Iran. Until the recent U.S. attacks, Iran has the largest stockpile of ballistic missiles in the Middle East. These missiles have a range of 2,000 kilometers and therefore can reach Israel and other countries in the Middle East. The facts and our history are clear. Iran has been a threat to its neighbors and the U.S. for the last 47 years. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again for just a few minutes. I thought we would talk about the Iran war and how that relates to the Space Force. Ever since Donald Trump created the Space Force, I thought it was a good idea, but I really haven't had any reason to talk about it in any significant way, even though I have been convinced that we are going to be fighting someday a battle, maybe in the upper atmosphere against China because of satellites. And there are all sorts of very ominous articles that I've thought about posting. But this one by Andrew Follett probably is the best because it helps us understand that when the president created Space Force, and a lot of people rolled their eyes. I mean, if you want an eye roll, say, I'm grateful that the president actually created the Space Force. And people go, oh, really? You're kidding me. You really think that's important? And the measure of jokes that came from the late night talk shows and all the rest. But here, this I think is a good illustration because the article, and you can read it for yourself, it is our second article, Iran War Proves Trump Was Right on Space Force. Well, give me a few minutes. Let's see if we can make the case. In this particular one, he makes the case that in the 20th century wars, the key was air power. You can recognize that air power wasn't that big a deal in World War I, but it was crucial in World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all the way through, of course, Desert Storm, all the rest. Okay, but what he makes the case is even though air power was important in 20th century wars, in 21st century wars, space power may be even more significant. And all you have to do is look at Operation Epic Fury. Okay, what are we going to say? He says, first of all, the argument that was made at the time is we need to prepare for war in space. As much as we wouldn't want it to take place, and people say, this is just somebody that's been watching too many Star Wars remakes or something like that. That is the case. And certainly here, the most remarkable things that have been taking place have been taking place because we've been able to fire missiles and even rockets in the upper atmosphere, which makes them virtually difficult or maybe impossible. I think they're impossible, but I'll even hold out to the possibility that they would be difficult to discern from the typical air defenses. And as a result, that's why he makes the case that success more recently demonstrates and vindicates President Trump's decision to elevate the Space Force as the sixth and newest branch of the American military. He has a couple quotes, but one from General Dan Kane specifically crediting Space Force role in both offensive and defensive military operation. Let me break them down, then we'll go on to some other issues. Prior to the 2019 establishment of Space Force, responsibility for anything that would be considered space combat was widely distributed across different U.S. military branches, leaving, as he says, America ill-prepared to fight in a conflict. At the start of the war, though, Space Command, here it is, disrupted, degraded, and blinded Iran's sensory communications and responsive capabilities. So when we go on offense, the first thing you want to do is to blind those who would want to actually implement some kind of defense against our offense. You can actually not only read the various statements about what they did and making Iran blind to incoming threats and dealing with electronic warfare, satellites, and the rest. You can read it and even follow some of the links to see that that was indeed the case. A good illustration of how blind the Iranian military was is Iran actually launched an attack against one of its oil tankers, one of their own. And again, as he points out, for some reason, Iran destroyed one of its own vessels. And the likely reason that Iran destroyed one of its own vessels was because their sensors were blind. Without, of course, America's reconnaissance satellites, we would effectively be restricted and uninformed, as Iran is today. So the loss of any air, we've lost, at least at the time when this was written, the only air losses came from friendly fire. We talked about that on the program the other day, which, if you think about it, is a remarkable achievement and illustrates the case. Now, the other part of that is we are not only launching missiles, we're also launching drones. Those are called LUCAS drones. What does that stand for? Low-cost, unscrewed combat attack system kamikaze drones. Okay, you didn't want to know all that, but it's on there. And again, those drones have actually devastated a good portion of Iran, and they are controlled by what? Again, satellite communication systems using, this goes back to Elon Musk, SpaceX's Starshield system. So in terms of that, you can see that the Space Force has helped us to be much more effective in terms of offensive weaponry. What about defense? Well, in the interest of time, I'll just mention one or two. First of all, space assets provided early warning against Iranian counterattacks, which began shortly after the first attacks. You have what are called OPIR, that stands for Overhead Persistent Infrared Satellites, as well as ground-based radars that were able to track missile launches in real time, alerting U.S. forces, and also enabling the intercepts that come from the Patriot missile or the THAAD, which stands again for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, and even the naval destroyers. And so again, you can see that as Iran fired its missiles at bases, more than 90% were neutralized mid-flight. Again, a lot of it goes back to Space Force. I think I've made the case, but let me just end with his last comments. He says the critical military importance of space has been obscured because every American conflict over the last few decades has been fought against minor powers. Operation Desert Storm was in many ways America's first space war because the Allied forces used extensive use of GPS, Global Positioning Satellite System, for targeting. But as he points out, getting America ready to fight a war in space is one of President Trump's best ideas. America's initial success in this conflict proves it. So again, if you have always wondered, why do we have a Space Force? What good is it? Is it making any positive impact on our military? The answer to that is yes. And that's why I've posted that second article, because, again, probably won't be covered by the legacy press. One, because a lot of them are against the war in the first place. Number two, some of it's pretty technical, as you probably picked up, and so they're not covering it. But nevertheless, if you'd like to read about it, it is our second article on the website, pointofview.net. Just before we take a break, let me mention a couple of things. First of all, my Viewpoints commentary is all about the threat from Iran, and I thought it would be appropriate to write because I recognize that when we talk about some of the times in which Iran has actually struck the United States, well, first of all, when the Shah of Iran was driven from power by the Ayatollah Khomeini, that was in 1979. I know a lot of you were not alive then. Or when Americans were held hostage, you had 52 American diplomats and staff held hostage. Again, that was during that period of time, 1980 all the way to 81. Of course, you have some of the attacks in 1983 when the Hezbollah forces blew up the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people, or when Hezbollah blew up the U.S. Marine barracks and killed 241 service members. A lot of those happened in the 70s and 80s. Some of you weren't even alive or maybe weren't even paying attention. I do talk about, of course, when we were fighting our war on terror, all the munitions being made by Iran, the coordination of Iranian operatives and the rest. And, of course, even the funding, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, of Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. We'll probably get into a little bit of that tomorrow with my guest, Paul Baraka, Dr. Paul Baraka. But, again, if you would like to read my Viewpoints commentary, it's available on the website, pointofview.net. If you click on the button that says Read Now, you'll also see a button that says Never Miss a Viewpoint. And if you aren't receiving my Viewpoint commentaries in your inbox, well, we would like to make those available to you. They come in your inbox Monday through Friday. Penedexters comes on Saturday. We also still have an opportunity for you to contact your two U.S. senators about what is called the SAVE Act. And it's interesting, President Trump so believes in it that he said he's not going to sign any new legislation unless the Senate passes the SAVE Act. We'll see where that goes. But nevertheless, if you think it's important, it's pretty obvious the president thinks it's important. We think it's important. And if you haven't contacted your two U.S. senators, let me encourage you to do so. All the information that you need is on the website, pointofview.net, and we'll be right back.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just mention that as a program note, we will have Dr. Paul Baraka with us in studio tomorrow. Happens to be in town, so we'll obviously be talking about what's going on in the Middle East. Then we'll get into a very good book interview that I think you'll appreciate as well, that God is on your side. I think you'll really appreciate that conversation as well. But just before we wind down for today, I thought we'd move from war to religion, or really Christianity. And I've got two pieces here, one by Gregory Lakaoff and then one by David French, and that will finish us off for today. Those articles are also posted on the website at pointofview.net. First of all, Gregory Lakaoff is an individual that I'd like to get to know a little bit more. He is listed, I noticed on Wikipedia and other places, as the youngest syndicated columnist, and that means he's pretty young, and maybe we could eventually use him on our next generation roundtable. But he wrote a number of pieces. Matter of fact, he's probably best known for having written some stuff about school choice, and that would be good to get him on to talk about that sometime. But this one is Stop Calling the United States a Secular State. And he is probably less aware of some of the things that First Liberty is doing, but he's obviously been able to find out about some of the things that Alliance Defending Freedom and other pro-life groups have done. And so I thought it would be helpful as we are coming to this 250th anniversary of this country. And just 2 weeks from today, we will be, of course, talking about our Truth Team Week. You can go to our website right now and notice that we have a banner, 1776-2026, Restoring America's Godly Heritage, 250 years. Very significant. And, of course, we will be sending you a lot of booklets. I think you've already received some on One Nation Under God, Federalist Papers, Bill of Rights, just to mention a few. We have some coming up on the Declaration of Independence. We have one coming out in the future, was America Founded as a Christian Nation, all sorts of things that I think you will find very helpful. Really trying to provide a little bit of the balance between extremes that say it was all secular or everybody was a Christian. Neither are true. The truth is a little bit in between, although here I think he's trying to help us understand that for many years, he points out, you have commentators saying that the United States is fundamentally a secular institution in which religion must remain entirely separate from politics. By the way, our booklet on church state certainly addresses that, and many of the people we've interviewed addresses that. And he points out, first of all, something we have talked about on this program many times before. The framers of the Constitution supported religious liberty and opposed the establishment of an official national church. So you have both parts of that showing up in the First Amendment. We'll get to that in just a minute. But he reminds us, as a very young man, that from the earliest days of the Republic, religious belief has remained deeply embedded in American institutions. For example, the presidential oaths conclude with the phrase, "So help me God." The national motto is "In God we trust." Of course, we have chaplains, and we have even the proceedings of federal courts, "God save the United States in this honorable court." You can go through a list, and he gives you a short list of those. And then he points out that we do, in some cases, have some court cases, and Kelly Shackelford's talk about this, and many other guests on this program, John Mark Davis Hall, I guess it is. I'm getting his name backward. But anyway, individuals that have been on the program talking about America's founding certainly have gotten into some of those issues as well. And, of course, he points out the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on religion illustrates this balance between government neutrality and religious liberty. And he cites, of course, one of those cases, Engel versus Vitale, which is the one about whether or not to have school prayer, in which he points that out, that in this particular case, they felt that government-written prayers was constituting an establishment of religion, but then immediately points out that the other aspect of that, you also have a landmark decision of Wisconsin versus Yoder, which illustrates the opposite principle, the protection protection of religious exercise against government regulation. The case was whether or not Amish parents could withdraw their kids from the formal schooling after the 8th grade. Given the fact now that we have homeschooling and all the rest, that would probably have been less of an issue. But nevertheless, I think he helps us understand that even in the past, when there seems to be a little bit more hostility towards religion, and we've talked about this with Jeff Mateer and Kelly Shackelford last week with Holly Randall and all sorts of other individuals, even then you saw, again, a balance between the establishment of religion and the free exercise of religion. And then he takes us to some of the more recent cases. And one of those is the case of 303 Creative, which is a case having to do with an individual who was a web designer and wanted to make sure that she could not be compelled by state law to create wedding websites celebrating same-sex marriages if that would violate her religious beliefs. And so you've had some really significant decisions. If I were to write this piece, I would add a couple others. The Kennedy decision about the individual who was the coach in Bremerton, Washington, who simply because he was praying on his own time after a game at the 50-yard line was fired, and the Supreme Court certainly dismissed that case, completely overturned that case, and between that case and others said that the whole so-called Lemon Test of 1971 was unconstitutional as well, and thus has provided greater religious liberty. Of course, some other Supreme Court cases that have come down from First Liberty, the Gerald Groff case of the postal worker who was seeking just a religious accommodation. He went to work for the post office because he didn't want to work on Sundays, but then along comes Amazon, and now you're supposed to deliver on Sundays, and he sought a religious accommodation, and that case was won 9-0, and we perhaps have more religious freedom now in 2026 than we've had in at least a half of a century or more, and so that's all good news. Well, then he winds down by saying the First Amendment protects both principles simultaneously. Religion to continue, he says, to influence political decision-making in both lawful and historically rooted ways. Many voters partly base their evaluation on candidates on moral values based on religious traditions. Moral arguments grounded in religion often surface in debates, as we talked about last hour, on abortion, marriage policy, bioethics. And he says citizens are free to consider those perspectives when choosing political leaders, and the idea that such reasoning must be excluded from a democratic debate misunderstands the nature of political participation. American voters have always drawn upon philosophical, cultural, and religious convictions when evaluating policy. And he goes on to point out that the Constitution protects the freedom to express those convictions in public life. He then, of course, goes to an area where he's been probably writing more on the terms of educational policy, the issue of school choice, and how we would, if we were wanting to really educate our students, they need to know more about Western civilization. And the ideas in Western civilization are found in the Bible, some of which are found from Greco and Roman law, but much of it is grounded, of course, in biblical perspectives, including the Declaration of Independence, which talks about the fact that we actually are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He goes on to remind us that the Western world's intellectual roots include biblical traditions, classical philosophy, and centuries of theological debate. And we, of course, deprive our students if we simply ignore all of that. And so he points out that we are living in a world, in this particular world, in this particular republic, which was designed to protect religious liberty. And he says the United States was not intended to erase religion from public life, which is why he concludes by saying portraying the country as entirely secular ignores both the historical evidence and constitutional principle. Religious beliefs shape this nation's founding ideals, and it continues to influence democratic debate today. To understand the United States, one must understand its history. Very good piece. It goes on for 5 pages, and this young writer is one that maybe we can find out more about him and maybe get him on our Next Generation Roundtable sometime. But nevertheless, just a reminder from a younger person who is looking at our history and reminding everyone, including his peers, who maybe haven't studied as much of this in the public schools, that the United States really is resting upon a Christian foundation. It's not just a secular state. So it's our 3rd article. I think you'll find it very interesting. Nothing else, pass it on to some younger people that you know, your children and grandchildren. Say, this is what a young person said about this country. What do you think about it? And have them read it. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. I thought we'd end with a piece by David French. He's been on the program with us before, and I've crossed paths with him. As a matter of fact, last time I saw him was at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Dallas, so that goes back a few years. But nevertheless, since we have had him on, he's been writing quite often for the New York Times. And he writes today, or yesterday, I should point out, about James Tallarico. And the title is James Tallarico is a Christian X-ray. I just put it down, James Tallarico, Christian Democrat. Now, some of you across the nation might say, well, you're talking about a Democratic candidate in the Texas U.S. Senate race, and that doesn't really affect me in my state. And I would agree, but I think it's becoming more of a national issue. I've sort of held back. We did talk about it a little bit on Friday, but David French puts it this way, and I think it illustrates the point. He says, these days, I'm asked more about James Tallarico than I'm asked about any politician not named Donald Trump. Okay. Now, again, James Tallarico is a 36-year-old Texas state representative. He was in the Texas Senate and the Democratic Party's latest and greatest hope for winning its first statewide election in more than 30 years. If you want to understand his background, he has a background in seminary. He's a Presbyterian seminarian. He's woke, I think is a very good statement that could be made about him. He has some sermons that are now starting to surface about things that would cause a lot of people that are listening to this program say, well, I'm sure I'm not going to vote for him. But that's not the point. The point is the fact that he won. Now, you could say that he won because he was not Jasmine Crockett. Everybody know who Jasmine Crockett is? I think you know who Jasmine Crockett is. So maybe some of the vote for him was a vote against her, saying, I just don't want her to even be running against whoever is going to be running on the Republican side, which is still up for the air. I'll leave that in just a minute. But nevertheless, David French gives him partial credit by saying, look, he's one of the most faith-forward politicians. That is, he doesn't just root his policies and ideology in his Christian beliefs. He's a seminarian willing to dive deeply into theology. I would disagree with his theology, but okay, let's go on. He talks about a sermon where James Tallarico says, Jesus liberates, Christian nationalism controls. Jesus saves, Christian nationalism kills. Jesus started a universal movement based on mutual love. Christian nationalism is a sectarian movement based on mutual hate. And as you might imagine, certainly one of the things that David French says is that we may disagree with some of the perspective he has, but nevertheless, he is right to call out Christian nationalism. Here's my caveat. I do know a lot about Christian nationalism because one of my colleagues is doing a paper on that and then even doing a podcast on it. And when you talk about people that are truly Christian nationalists, and I've looked at some of the things they say. They, for example, are quite racist. They are white supremacist. They actually don't even believe women should be allowed to vote. So, I mean, that's pretty strong. But I do get the sense that when Christian nationalism is used by James Tallarico, he's meaning anybody who is maybe even patriotic. He would say that, many of the people we've had on this program would be Christian nationalists. We've done programs on Point of View on Christian nationalism with people like David French and a variety of others. And so there is a core of individuals that we, as we pointed out before, I even hate to say they're on the far right, because in some respects the circle almost goes all the way around to being more libertarian, but nevertheless that is the case. Now, the concern that James Tallarico brings up is, in one interview he said, we find that oftentimes the so-called evangelicals, and so he doesn't always call evangelicals Christian nationalists, but he's pretty close to align the two, are actually prioritizing two issues Jesus never talked about. Of course, that's abortion and homosexuality, and they focus on two things instead of feeding the hungry and healing the sick. That's, again, where I would disagree with James Tallarico. If you look at, as we talked about even on Friday, the different organizations that are funding outreach to the homeless, outreach to the poor, a lot of them tend to be evangelicals. They tend to be politically conservative, but okay, we'll leave it at that. But the point he's making is simply that if you're going to focus on this, you're ignoring everything else, which is why then David French wisely asked this question: why can't we do it all? Provide high-quality health care, welcome immigrants who come here legally, and protect the unborn. So again, sometimes this false dichotomy is something we're going to hear more about. Unless you again say, well, that's something you're going to have to deal with in the state of Texas. Just recently, we had a very good column by Robert Knight pointing out that, for example, the governor of the state of Kentucky is quoting Bible verses. He may be running for the presidency. We're seeing other Democrats quoting Bible verses, and it used to be the only people quoting Bible verses were Republicans. Now it's Democrats, and I think it's going to be even more important for us to think biblically and carefully about some of those issues as well. And so he points out that, look, David French says, on certain issues, I might agree with James Tallarico. In other cases, I would disagree. He's a political and religious progressive. I'm a political and religious conservative. But then he wants to give some credit, I think it should be given, to the fact that some of the comments he's making about the fact that we need more decency in America. You agree? I think so. We've talked on this program so many times about the need for civility, or you can go to, for example, the book of Galatians and talk about the virtues of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And he makes the case, that is, David French makes the case, that we have orthodoxy, orthopraxy, and orthocardia. What's orthocardia? Well, it's what it sounds like, having the right heart. And again, James Tallarico says, I'm tired of being pitted against my neighbor. I'm tired of being told to hate my neighbor. It's been more than 10 years of this kind of politics. Again, he recognizes politics as a blood sport. Politics is trolling and owning. Politics is total war. It tears families apart. It ends friendships. It leaves us feeling terrible all the time. And if you have found that you don't even want to talk about politics around the family table, or politics around the Christmas table, the Thanksgiving table, or even Easter, you know what we're talking about. So if nothing else, David French really at least would probably disagree with some of the statements that James Tallarico makes. I would disagree with even more, perhaps, than he would. But he says he is kind of a Christian X-ray to look at our heart. And I think it is a sad commentary that oftentimes when we point you to, in this case, our take action item, we say, when you send your letter to your 2 United States senators, do it in a gracious way. The fact that we even have to say that tells us that some people have not been gracious. Some people have not been trying to be kind, but still firm in their Christian convictions. And so I thought it might be helpful for you to read a good piece that was in the New York Times. David French disagrees with some of the interesting theology, I'll call it Interesting by James Tallarico, but says maybe even there we can learn something about having a good heart. Orthocardia, which is another phrase we can use as well. Well, that's all we have for today. We will spend some time tomorrow to talk about the Middle East and then talk about how Jesus really is your friend. I think you will really appreciate the conversation over the 2 hours tomorrow. But let me again encourage you to go to the website, find out more about the Council for Life, read my commentary on the threat from Iran, and most importantly, I hope you'll take action to support the SAVE Act. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
You know as well as I do that elections matter, but political change can also be fleeting. After all, no politician is America's savior. To truly make a difference, the kind that lasts, we need to repair the soul of our nation. We need to reclaim America's godly heritage. We need to restore a biblical worldview to the culture. And here's the question that I want you to ask yourself. What can I do to help restore a biblical worldview to American culture? At Point of View, that is our mission, restoring a biblical worldview and reclaiming America's godly heritage. And we invite you to partake in that mission by joining the Truth Team. Learn more about the impact you can have as a Truth Team member by visiting pointofview.net or by calling 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.